Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai rarau mai ki tēnei hui. Tātahi he karakia timatanga tēnei, kia karakia tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mākena kena ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tae. E hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhunga, tihei mauri ora. Tēnā no tātou, tēnei te mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Welcome to this webinar discussion of the report First Do No Harm about the treatment of women in our prisons. To begin our session and to introduce our wonderful panel of speakers, I'd like to hand over now to EEO Commissioner Sonoa Mali'i Karanina Sumio. Kia ora Karanina.
Tēnā koutou katoa, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, Raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Pacific greetings to everybody who's online today, and special greetings to our colleagues and friends who may be overseas or are beaming in also. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our discussion, a very important discussion concerning the welfare and the well-being of our wāhine in prison. It's my absolute honor to be here with you today with our special guests, our panelists, who will be known to many of you as very strong women. So I will do the minimum talking as possible so I can give the time to them and also to make sure that we have enough time for questions from you. So once again, welcome Maloso for tēnā koutou. It is my honor to introduce to you the producer of the report, the esteemed Dr. Sharon Shalev. It is my honor to introduce you Dr. Shalev. Shalev is a research associate at the Centre for Criminology at the University of Oxford and also a fellow at the Mannheim Centre for Criminology in London School of Economics. Her work as an independent researcher and consultant on human rights and prisons includes providing expert opinions on prison conditions, design, regimes, and compatibility with human rights directives, and also acting as an independent advisor to government departments, intergovernmental organizations, and professional bodies on the regulation, use, and effects of solitary confinement practices and the use of force and instruments of restraint, and advising on their adherence to international human rights standards. Dr. Shalev's knowledge, experience, insights, and passion in addressing human rights issues in prisons have been invaluable to the work of the Human Rights Commission. In 2016, the Human Rights Commission invited Dr. Shalev to undertake a review of seclusion and restraint practices in our prisons here in Aotearoa. Her 2017 report, Thinking Outside the Box, contained an extensive set of recommendations to improve policies and practices in our prisons. Her 2020 follow-up report, Time for a Paradigm Shift, review progress against her 2017 recommendations. The focus on the experience of women in detention in the report we are launching today emerged in response to that second report on the Time for a Paradigm Shift. Due to the concerns about the apparent high use of segregation, some of us interpret that as solitary confinement and force against women, in particular Māori women. So I warmly and humbly welcome you, Dr. Shalev. The floor is yours.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much, Commissioner, and thank you to all of our guests, and thank you to the Human Rights Commission for allowing me to undertake this research and the reports that preceded this report. And thank you for this warm introduction. This report, First Do No Harm, was born out of concerned by what I saw in Auckland Women's Prison in particular, but also what the data and other reports were telling me about practices in women's prisons across the board. The report shines a light on some of the harmful practices in the women's prisons, the use of force against women, degrading practices and procedures, overuse of segregation, and an apparent lack of compassion, which was quite evident from the harsh treatment and use of restraints and force, following self-harm attempts by women who were clearly very unwell. Self-harm in general was very high in the women's prisons. The report asks if some of the practices and procedures in the prisons, including strip searches, forcing women to wear anti-rape gowns, which are both degrading and also, as it turns out, quite inefficient, since quite a lot of self-harm incidents were done using this protective clothing. The report finds that while there have been some encouraging policy developments in recent years and a commitment to kaupapa Māori approaches, deep challenges remain. In particular, the report identifies a very worrying gap between all these policy statements and practices on the ground. So despite a recognition of the unique and complex needs of women in prisons and the level of harm and trauma that they bring with them, they were nonetheless subjected to solitary confinement, the use of force, and the use of pepper spray, often in response to very minor incidents. Practices, in short, were punitive, anachronistic, gendered, and very, very damaging. Some key findings very briefly. Unfortunately for me, I can't pick yet a hard copy of the report, but some of you may have the pleasure to just very quickly some key findings. So overall, there was a continued and high use of solitary confinement and other punitive practices. In 2019, which is the year that the report focuses on, women were segregated significantly more than men, which is interesting. The majority of segregations were relatively short, but there were 101 occasions in 2019 where women spent longer than 15 days, sometimes much longer than 50 days in segregation. And 15 days is the time limit set by the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and by the UN Nelson Mandela rules as a time after which the solitary confinement becomes prolonged and therefore prohibited as a form of torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. This punishment was particularly directed at Maori and Pacific women who were disproportionately segregated in the management and separates units. These are units aimed at punishing women and controlling them. At Auckland Prison, women's prison, as many as 93% of the segregations, the longer segregations, were of Maori or Pacific women. Women's management plans, which were supposed to be tailored to the individual needs and challenges of each woman, were generic and they were focused on compliance. And staff attitudes really appeared to be quite punitive and inflexible, not using opportunities to de-escalate situations, and in fact almost behaving in a way that escalated situations. And I was not clear, and I imagine the women are not clear either, what exactly they had to do in order to leave segregation. I saw very little evidence of engagement and encouragement of pro-social behavior. In intervention and support units, which are units for women identified as being at risk of self-harm, women, again, were locked up in solitary confinement for all or most of the day. They had no personal belongings with them and no access to activities, programs, and very little access, sometimes no access at all, to interventions, including psychological interventions. What else? The report records several incidents where women were restrained, forcibly undressed upon admission to an ISU, and forced to wear anti-rape gowns, even if this was a source of agitation and conflict, as was the case on several occasions. Pepper spray was used 24 times in women's prisons. Data that I later received from corrections indicate even higher use of that. Interestingly, this was second only to the use in Christchurch men's prison. So very high use, higher than the highest security prison for men, Auckland prison. And again, I found that the pepper spray was used following minor incidents, really minor incidents. Some women were sprayed inside their cells in contravention of international guidance and good practice. The report contains 26 recommendations. I'm not going to read them all, but really, I think that my key message is that all the strategies for the management of women that are identified by the Department of Corrections on policy documents and the studies they commissioned need to be implemented and need to be implemented urgently. And that implementation needs to be properly monitored. There is no point in having a policy championing trauma-informed practice whilst at the same time traumatizing women further by, for example, forcibly undressing and strip searching them. It makes no sense to speak of strengthening families and communities while preventing a woman from speaking to her children and family. So I think the key message of this report is, if you cannot do good, then at the very least, do no harm. Women in prison should be treated with respect for the human dignity, with empathy and with compassion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shalev. You can, for our participants, the report should be on the Human Rights Commission webpage. You can reach that, and so please go on to that and seek a copy. We like to think that New Zealand will not aim very low as to first do no harm. We expect much more from our prison service. And certainly our wāhine deserve much more than what they're getting now. So we'll go on to our next speaker, but thank you very much for that succinct summary, Dr. Shalev. Wait while I navigate my computer. So I will now introduce Professor Tracy McIntosh, a wāhine tour that's well known to many of us. So Professor Tracy McIntosh is Ngai Tuhoe, is a sociologist and professor of Indigenous Studies and co-head of Te Wānanga o Waipapa, the School of Māori Studies and Pacific Studies at the University of Auckland. She was recently a member of the Welfare Expert Advisory Group at Tuepu Hapai Aotearoa, the Safe and Effective Justice Advisory Group. Professor McIntosh is widely regarded for her expertise on a range of topics, including Māori and incarceration, state institutions, and Māori women in incarceration, crime and marginalization, and Indigenous peoples and the criminal justice system, and family violence prevention. Professor McIntosh works extensively within the criminal justice community, including with people in prison and their whānau. It's my honor to welcome you, Professor McIntosh. The floor is yours.
Kia ora, kia ora. Mauri ora kia koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Ko waio, ko ngā tātua te waka, ko te tāhuhu o ho, ki taha te moinga, ko oru e kaurau, te awa, ko tamarau ki te kororo, te tangata, ko otanuku te whenua, ko otanuku te papakainga, ko otanuku te marae. Ko Ngāti Kaura, Kiri Kawa, ki te rako te hapu, ko Tūhoi te iwi, ko Tracy McIntosh tēnei. Oku rangatira, tēnā koutou katoa. E te rangatira, Dr. Sharon Shalev, tēnā koe. And I just really want to start this and just thanking you for the work and for the report. It's a sobering report. It's a hard report to read. And if we read this report alongside the
3 reports that were released by the Inspectorate last week, we really start to see the breadth, the scope, the depth of the issues that we face. And we have to recognize our real strength and our ability through collective action to create transformative change. And by that, really drawing on the expertise, particularly of those women and wāhine Māori who have experienced incarceration. And I really want to mihi to you, Aotearoa. I want to mihi to you in terms of your leadership. I want to mihi to you in terms of your expertise. And in starting that, and I realize my emotion, even though I've worked in this area for so many years. But I also want to recognize the other, there's many people who work in this area, and I'm really just going to now recognize the wāhine Māori who are working in this area. I want to recognize Patricia Walsh. I want to recognize her again for her experience, for her expertise, for the araha she brings to this important mahi, to Te Atawhai, Neira Te Rangi, again for her experience and for her expertise, to Helena Rattray, to Lily George, to Julia Whaiputi, to Anne Wipu, to Nawai McGregor, Ine Rakati, Jean Sua. I really want to recognize those wāhine Māori who are working in this area, but also to recognize the many others, our allies who also work in this area. And I want to also mihi to Amanda Hill and to Hannah Kim for their very important elements in terms of the legal system. And at the center of this is the experience and the expertise of our women. And I do want to name Mihi Bassett. I do want to name Tarina McClutchy. I do want to name Karma Cripps, not because they were the only women who have borne the burden and suffered within this particular element of the system, but because they have been named and they have stood up and they have showed their expertise. So I do wish to mihi to them. Mihi particularly I've known since she was a 16-year-old. And so I have a really strong association. And I know that she brings her love to you. She's an astonishing young woman with many qualities, with many strengths. And I bring her to the room. I often, in responding to the work of your work, Sharon, just how significant it is for us. It's just that recognition around, if I'm thinking about it from a Te Reti perspective, I'm thinking it from Te Ao Māori perspective, but really, if I'm thinking about it from a human perspective, what is the human work that needs to be done? When I was reading one of the reports today, which I'd already read before, and I've spoken at depth, particularly with Carmen and with Mihi about this, I was still brought to tears. The need to ensure that we whakamana all of those within it, within the system. I often draw on poetry, and I'm just going to do a really short one here, and the rest I think can perhaps come up within the questions. And I really want to ensure that Aotearoa, because her experience and her expertise is so significant here. And I'm just going to do one poem. I usually draw on the poetry of the women themselves within the system, but I'm just going to draw on actually one of mine. That's so much informed by their experience. For the last 12 years, I've been going into Auckland Women's, and I'm so much in debt in terms of the experience and expertise that comes from within there. So I just want to sort of give us this sort of thought, and probably I'll leave it at that. It's called Our Incarceration. Is it the dark of me laid across generations? Is it the name of me passed through complex histories? Is it the loss of me wrought by those with manifest destiny? Is it the shame of me created by their acts of tyranny? To sit in these confines, a cell amongst cells, within the abject lie that being a prisoner is the nature of me. And here I'm trying to question why wāhine Māori are disproportionately incarcerated in the prison system of New Zealand. It asks whether the answer to understanding collective incarceration can be found in responses to colonial state and popular racist discourses, or in the intergenerational transfer of inequality through dual processes of deprivation and dispossession. It creates the state processes that seek to render whakapapa and cultural links as deviant through removal, dismissal, dislocation, and alienation from our resources, distancing us from our language, from our rituals, and from our cultural practices. It interrogates the power relations and processes of oppression that are part of the neo-colonial project. Until the lie that prison is the inevitable outcome and indeed the destiny of certain groups, and the way that this becomes normalized and naturalized before that lie is fully revealed. It illustrates the necessity of knowing why we are, where we are, what are the trajectories that lead to prison, what are the trajectories that lead to practices and processes that create, that produce and reproduce so much harm. So I think I will leave it with there. There's certain things that I want us to consider and reflect on about what redress and response might be, about the way that we can shift those practices. And I do recognize that this report and the other reports and the testimony of Mihi and others is shaped and informing what we're doing now. We can see it in the new strategy that's coming out, that the expertise has been shaped, but collective impact, collective action is so important. And even what I'm saying to you there in that poem is a real recognition that so much of the harm happens outside of the prison gate. And so again, what is our own responsibilities? How can we hold ourselves accountable to ensure that incarceration is not seen as the solution to socioeconomic, cultural problems, and that really, that we, as an abolitionist, it's hard for me to talk about how you make the prison better, but we have a cultural obligation at the moment, whilst we still have them in place, to do that. So I'll finish there. Ngā mihi nui.
Kia ora, Tracy. Thank you very much, and thank you for voicing that attitude that prison is the inevitable destination of some peoples. Thank you for that, because I do believe that some people hold that position, hold that view in terms of Indigenous peoples around the world. So thank you for your challenge, and the possibility that you raise in terms of the role of civil society in holding the state accountable for its duties to uphold the rights of our wāhine in prison is a very important question. I think having this webinar is one way that we can increase awareness of everybody about what's really going on. So thank you very much, Dr. McIntosh. Our third speaker is Aotearoa. She is Ngāti Pikiao, Ngāti Pro. She's a justice advocate that many of us here will know, speaking out for equitable outcomes in the criminal justice system. She's a very passionate advocate for Indigenous rights. Aotearoa's current advocacy projects are around repealing the Bail Amendment Act 2013 and increasing the use of restorative justice alternatives to harm. Aotearoa has written compellingly in a spin-off on issues relating to the human rights of prisoners and the experience of women of the criminal justice system, drawing from her own personal experience of being inside. Aotearoa wants to help create a system that restores balance while keeping the mana and dignity of whānau intact. She has recently completed an honours degree in psychology and criminology and is planning to pursue a master's degree. Aotearoa currently works as a restorative justice administration manager at the Resolution Institute in Wellington. It is my honor to introduce Aotearoa to you. The floor is yours, Aotearoa.
Talofa lava lau sasunga sau no mali'i karanina sumeo. Whawhetai tele mō lau galuenga. Dr. Shalev tēnā koe, Professor Tracy McIntosh, tēnā koe, nā mihi kia Jessica mō tō karakia, tēnā tātou katoa. My name is Aotearoa and I am of Ngāti Porou and Ngāti Pikiao descent. I was sent to prison in February 2013 on non-violent drugs charges, and I was released in December 2014. At the time of my release, I thought that I would never be able to get a job, that I would never be able to regain respect within my community, and that I would not be able to overcome the stigma of being a prisoner. During my imprisonment, I reached a point where I thought I could at least hope to be the best mother that I could be when I was released. But 11 months into my sentence at Auckland Region Women's Corrections Facility, my son passed away due to an accidental drowning. The week before he had passed, his uncle had brought him to the prison for a visit. As they had travelled from Whakatane, they thought that they were entitled to a special visit, but they were turned away, and so they planned to come back in 2 weeks. There was no flexibility. My son passed away that following week, and I was still called up for visits the week after he had passed away. I tried to explain that the visit with my son would not be going ahead because he had passed away, but I was sent to visits anyway. And of course, there was no one there to meet me, and I was sent back to my unit. This meant that the last time I saw my son was through the glass of a visits room in the Aotearoa police station as I was on my way to the Auckland Region Women's Corrections Facility. I will never forget the support that was given to me by the other women alongside me in the prison. They are mothers, they are daughters, they are cousins, they are aunties, they are grandmothers, they're friends. Sharing my story is a way to honour them. Telling our stories for ourselves and for our whānau still in the prison is a part of healing. People are familiar with the statistics, and it's our stories that bring those statistics to life, because we want people to know that behind every number, every statistic is a person with a family who is part of a community. To bring into the light the conditions and treatment in the prison that are unacceptable. The sad reality is Māori women's voices are fundamental to those stories being told. Acknowledgement of the harm we experience, that allows us the space to grieve over our mistreatment, and they are first steps to being able to move on. In the prison, I developed an anxiety of being in crowds and public spaces. I never had that before. I struggled on release and constantly asked for permission to do even the most mundane activities, like asking my brother if I was allowed to step into a shop. Compliance with the orders from guards was my new default. I was a broken person, released without the skills to adapt to the new normal. When I dared to dream small dreams again, with each achievement I dared to dream a little bigger. And it was through the love of my family that I was able to grow in confidence, start to rebuild my life, and dare to dream again. Māori women in prisons need to be considered in terms of their families, their children, and their communities, because the consequences of imprisonment also impact their families, their children, and their communities. For people that don't have that family support, that I, so grateful to have in my life. How can we provide systems of support that function in the same way as a loving family? I think about that a lot. When I read the Seclusion and Restraint report released last year, I felt a sense of relief that the truth was coming out in a way that legitimised and validated the truth-telling of formerly incarcerated women and the woman currently in prison. I applauded the recommendations that challenged us to dream of a future departing from the present punitive prison culture, a future that was focused on meaningful change and mapped specific humanizing approaches. The first Do No Harm report gives me a sense of vindication for the women in prison and their advocates who have been consistent and unwavering in their calls for humane treatment that respects the dignity of women and in particular Māori women. Shalev describes the disconnect between corrections policy and the implementation of that policy. She emphasises that corrections recognises the vulnerabilities of women in their care, and this disconnection, this failure to implement policy means women continue to be at risk of further harm in New Zealand prisons. Successive policies have previously made little difference. In effect, this looks like increasing self-harm, life-threatening self-harm and suicides. This looks like increasingly punitive responses to women in distress who are being subjected to policies intended for men. This looks like children being maintained in distress and poverty, whole communities disempowered, underfunded and under-resourced to meet the challenges these issues present. It looks like a mentality or a culture in the prison that diminishes Māori women, disproportionately targeting them for seclusion, for solitary confinement. In my opinion, despite the aspirational goals of corrections, things have gotten worse with the introduction of more punitive methods, such as gassing women in their cells, overextended stays in seclusion. And just recently, just in the last couple of weeks, a young woman was going to be separated from her baby after giving birth, and it was a successful, at Auckland Women's, and it was the successful action of advocates and not the compassion of corrections that have led to this young woman and her child being entered to the mother and babies unit now. So we do need a new way forward, and this must be informed by acknowledging the harm in New Zealand prisons for women and in particular Māori women. By telling our stories, we can form ways forward that target those pain points to ensure that we can treat women with respect and dignity and humane and using humane methods. And I'd like to leave it there.
Kia ora, Aotearoa. And condolences again for the loss of your son. I know it's some time ago, but it's still very, very real. They never really leave us, so I just want to acknowledge that. And thank you for expressing the voices of others who come and talk to you about their experiences of what's happening in our prisons. Kia ora. So we'll now open it to some questions. So people, please feel free to offer us your questions. But can I start with this one question? What can a women's prison service look like if it was based on Tiriti Waitangi and human rights in your view? And I'm asking that to panel. So perhaps Aotearoa, if I can start with you, then we go to Tracy and on to Dr. Shalev.
Yeah, for me to answer that question, when we're talking about basing a women's prison on the Treaty of Waitangi model is difficult in a sense that would be something that's determined, in my mind, that would be something that's determined by the hapu or the iwi in the different areas where these places would be situated, and that it would be up for them to determine how it would be shaped. I also think that it's important to recognise that we're missing our obligations under the treaty right now. The current prisons, there's policy that says there should be co-design with Māori, and that doesn't seem to be happening that I'm aware of. I mean, I'm always open to being wrong, and I hope that is happening, but we don't seem to be seeing any fruits of that maybe just yet. One of the things I think that we could look at is in the UK, there's the Askham Grange, there's an open women's prison. Maybe that's something that we can consider models like that. But I think definitely if we are looking at the Treaty of Waitangi and the care of Māori women, then it needs to have cultural, philosophical and constitutional foundations that are defined by Māori, and then that these these types of confinement are then determined by Māori.
Thank you very much, Aotea. Tracy, would you like to offer a view on that?
Yeah, and I just want again, Aotea, just to mihi to you. It was a beautiful presentation that you gave, and I just want to recognise this is our greatest strength when we draw on the purako of our women to create these real shifts, these transformative shifts. In terms of the question put forward to me, I don't think you can have a Māori prison, and a Māori prison is an anathema to us. So I think that's a really clear element, so that as an abolitionist, when I hear about people talking about a Māori prison, it really creates a really mamai with me, and I recognise what Aotea is saying, that if we're going to do whatever it is that we're going to do, it will be the hapu and others who need to determine those elements, but I don't see that happening within the prison walls. We can draw on really strongly on Moana Jackson's work about what rehabilitation centres look like. What are the other alternatives that we need to have outside of those? We recognise that real harm is done in society, and that there has to be, all societies regulate and do elements around harm. So it's certainly not that there's a recognition that harm happens, but we have to recognise we have to do something first around those other harms. So when we're thinking about, when we're reflecting on something like sexual violence, psychological violence, emotional violence, family violence, whānau violence, we must ensure that we first address and indeed seek to address state violence, colonial forms of violence, legislative violence, structural violence, political violence, economic violence, institutional violence, collective violence. I think that if we work with those harms there, rather than seeing the prison as, as I said, as a sort of a geographical solution to socioeconomic and cultural problems. So for me, that there is so much work to be done in that space. Now, as I did say, we still have an obligation, including a cultural obligation, to all of our whānau who are in prison. And so I do think that the principles, as noted in terms of the treaty principles, we do have those policies in place. They're strong. It's the implementation is important. I have had both the privilege of working with so many women, but also working with correction staff who want much better outcomes themselves. And a lot of it's the mechanism of coercive control. Aotea spoke about it. That mechanism of coercive control, it is anti-therapeutic. It harms. So when I think about, I always think about when you have good people and bad systems, how are we able to create the change? So I do think that there are ideas in play. I think there are spaces of real possibilities of transformative change, but we need to be so courageous. And to do that, we need to have such strong collective support behind us.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Dr. Saliev, can I pose that question to you also, but just seeking perhaps your observations of Indigenous models of service around the world, in any that you've seen, perhaps.
Thank you. I agree with both my esteemed co-panelists. I don't have a lot to add. Unfortunately, I can't direct you at any good practice examples. I agree with Professor McIntosh that we need to address inequalities that go way back. You know, there is a clear line. Anyone listening to the transcripts, reading transcripts or listening to testimonies given to the Committee on Abuse and Care, for example, the line between that and what is still happening in our prisons is so obvious. You know, if it's those strip searches again and all sorts of practices. So we really do need to go to basics. Prison cannot sort all the social problems that need addressing. If we do have prisons, I believe in therapeutic communities. I think they're great for women. There are some very, very good examples in the UK and in the United States as well, surprisingly. And I think that kind of structure would work well for women. And I think that it would work well for Maori women as well. I think New Zealand has great potential. It's quite frustrating because time and time again, you know, I write a report, I make recommendations, the department responds with all sorts of big plans and then nothing changes. And I think we really need to see some substantive, real change happening.
What do you think is causing that gap? I mean, you know, if we look at the national strategy for our women's prisons, if we look at the Hokairangi strategy, everything sounds right. We understand, you know, the different needs of our wāhine in prison compared to our men. We understand that, you know, the physical structure of prison. We know all this stuff, but still it's not transferring to any transformation on the ground. Is it more than money? What do you think is getting in our way going forward and doing better?
Well, I suspect there is a degree of racism and sexism, and the combination of those two things is quite lethal in women's prisons. I'm turning to Tracy and Aotearoa to hear what you think. Why are things not changing? I don't know.
I mean, I think there's some of them come out of your recommendations as well, and a lot of that is about what trauma-informed, culturally informed care looks like. It's around training, it's around the people, it's around the need for that really high level of specialization. Aotearoa knows there's many of the women have strong relationships with certain people who work within the prison systems, who draw on them. And I'm sure even with you, Aotearoa, when you left, you know, you recognize that those relationships with the women who are incarcerated, but also with some of the staff. And it's something that I really do is observing the people there. There needs to be, in many ways, a great more value put in terms of that training and then value in terms of that expertise. So I think that's a huge issue that you've got ideas that play in place and coming down there's a real push there. Comes back to though that compliance and coercive control that you really note. It certainly seems for women that the demands around compliance and coercive control are emphasized to far greater degree, and so that we saw that some of those things that we saw were for relatively minor issues that then de-escalated, issues that would not have ever meant that you get segregated or unlikely to get segregated in a male prison. So I think there's some elements in terms of the really different response. So there's something in that space around the real need for change, for bringing people along. But the element of having the women as decision makers, the women really drawing on those panels within it, and and I do recognize that there's been a number of panels, and in fact that the latest strategy I think is the first strategy which actually has the women's voices directly in it. But we need to expand on that. We need to really draw on that expertise if we want to, you know, and the other problem, which is the problem is, and Aotearoa deals with it, it's the courts, it's the things before you even get into the prison. Why are we sending so many of the women into prison? So I think there's a whole range of those elements. And I did note the thing around the conflating of segregation and isolation, and I understand that particular issue. But the fact is, what does it feel like? What does it feel like for the women inside? What does segregation feels like? And without a doubt, for many of our women who have been under that regime, it has isolated them, it has cut them, it has culturally cut them, it's cut them from whānau, and it's cut them from themselves. They lose themselves.
Can I just very briefly come in on this particular, because I saw that statement, and as Professor McIntosh says, you know, and as well as feeling like segregation, the simple fact is that the women are banged up in their cell for 20 to 23 hours a day, meaning that it complies with the official definition of what solitary confinement is. So although the department does not like the term solitary confinement, and they say, you know, ISU is different to segregation, it should be different, but it's not. The input of health staff was minimal, and at the moment the ISUs and the segregation unit in practice are very, very similar. The report, by the way, discusses them separately, so I don't know about this conflating, but never mind. Thank you.
Yes, it does discuss them separately. You do define them, so never mind. Aotearoa, your view on the barriers to us realizing our aspirations and our, you know, better outcomes for our wāhine in prison.
Yeah, first I want to begin with acknowledging the people who are trying to bring about better outcomes for our women, in particular our Māori women. I know there's some of the work that's been going on at Christchurch Women's, various pilots that are underway. So there is some good work being undertaken by corrections, you know, trying to head in this direction of better outcomes for the women. I also want to acknowledge a point that was made earlier. There are some good guards. You know, there are, from my experience, most of the people who want to become corrections officers have some, want to help. You know, that's kind of the reason why they've signed up in the first place. But there's barriers presented to those people in being able to realize, you know, that aspiration of being in a position where they can help these women. And some of that has to do with the organisation culture, where their efforts are stifled. And then there are individuals within that organisation who make it more difficult for the staff that are trying to do all these meaningful things on working with the woman. And so I think Tracy made the point. I think this comes back to the training and perhaps retraining. And if there are staff who aren't willing to, embrace and come on board with these new policy initiatives, and that's a real problem. And that's going to, continue to hamper the rollout of these policies if there are, obstructive individuals and that are able to kind of maintain a culture within the organisation that prevents the people who are in there wanting to do good, who are there for the right reasons and for the causes that I just talked about, aren't able to do that.
No, totally acknowledge, that there are lots of people doing really, really, working really, really hard, trying to make the best out of the situation. I mean, we acknowledge the significant drop in the number of women prisoners, from 700 or so in 2018 to now about 545, something like that. So they are working really, really, really hard. I want to acknowledge that. As women's rights advocate, can I be a little bit more provocative and just revisit some of the points that all three of you made about the context being where women have to obey. It's about obedience and control. And we're not living in caves anymore, but it seems like there's still an attitude that we need to control women. And I reflect on one incident you mentioned in the report, Dr. Shalev, of a woman who refused to take off her hair tie. and as a result ended up being held down by 4 guards to get the hair tie off. There was another woman who had her period and refused to be strip searched, and again ended up having 3 or 4 guards on top of her. And so like in another context, that could be seen as a group sexual assault. So so this attitude about women in prison and simply being expected to do what they're told is really, really disturbing for a first world country, and a country that punches above its weight in many things globally. Would anyone like to reflect on that? I mean, how do we get people to realize that that's a violation of human rights, a violation of it's cruel and inhumane treatment, and it can't happen. Is there a different way of talking, or what can we do? How can we help the system recognize its own infliction of violence on our women and not say it's because of policy, or there's something really, really disturbing?
I mean, I think that culturally informed and trauma-informed care then becomes so critical. It is astonishing to me when there is a recognition that the vast majority of women have suffered violence, and for many of them sexual violence, and that we have practices like kneeling down to be handcuffed behind your back. And I've spoken directly to the women about what that makes you feel. People who have been subjected to sexual violence, some from the very youngest of age, then having particular types of measures. And one of the things around these types of measures, it doesn't make people more collectively secure. It doesn't make the officers, it's not safer for officers, and it's not safer for women. So there's an inability to de-escalate, and in some ways it is really difficult for the women not to see these processes as breaking them, not just breaking them as individuals, but breaking them as women.
Yeah.
And so there's so much of those elements. When you do see what trauma-informed care can look like, and I've just seen it very recently with one of the young women who spent over 12 years inside in a different environment now that she's on the outside. Exactly what Aotearoa talks about, just how difficult it is the outside once you've been in. The things you need to navigate that system are so maladaptive for the outside system. But there's something within women prisons that is around that, what we often used to talk about, the double deviance of the burden of the whatever they went in for, but also that they're women. But so many of the practice that come up in Dr. Shalev's report, so important, it's nearly impossible to think that we would subject women to them. Any woman at any time. And we're subjecting some of our most vulnerable women to these practices. That should stop today. Someone asked, what can we stop today? That's the thing that can stop today. Handcuffing behind your backs and having to kneel down, having to lie down on the ground and put you up, must stop today. These forms of segregation must stop today. I recognize the need to ensure that people are able to be safe within that environment. I think many of these practices make people much more unsafe. Yeah. And they harm, they produce and reproduce violence.
Yeah, absolutely, totally agree. Dr. Shalev, did you want to respond or share?
I'm sitting here and nodding my head busily. Yes. I absolutely agree with every word. And also, back to the training issue, staff need to be properly trained. In segregation units, if you have them, which I think you shouldn't, but if you do, you need your most experienced staff, not your least experienced staff, which I think is what's happening now. Yes, and all these practices need to stop. I'd also like to see a stop to all the strip searches and these really degrading anti-rape gowns. They don't work. People rape them anyway, so why bother? And you asked what can we do to kind of have, one of the reasons I decided to write this report with such detailed descriptions of some of the practices is exactly in the hope that some staff and hopefully their leaders would read that and think, we can't be doing that. This is just not right.
Yeah, I think that's because when they're in the zone, I suppose it's hard to remember humanity, I suppose, and that's the worry. When I read those stories, I mean, someone had her period, and and they insisted on strip searching her, and it was basically like a group assault. In another context, that's how it will be seen. And
absolutely,
people to realize that's actually what they're participating in. They would never do it to their daughter or mother or grandmother or auntie. So, and that's so dangerous that came out of the report, that we've lost sight of our basic humanity. So very, very powerful. If there was a message that we could send to corrections and Minister Davis right now, this will be our last question. Can I have a response from each of you? What would we ask the minister and the corrections?
Well, my message would be, first, do no harm. Stop all these harmful practices. And, I don't want to forget about the men that are also kind of suffering in segregation units. There is a lot of work to be done there as well. But with the women, just stop all these practices, train staff properly, focus more on the nitty-gritty, less big statements and more actual practices on the ground, and do it quickly. The damage is immense. The damage is also to staff, I think, as well as the women.
Yes.
And then they take it to their communities, and we just perpetuate harm this way, and this has to stop. That's my message.
Thank you, Dr. Shalev. Aotea?
Sorry, just turning on my mic. For Calvin Davis, I think it's really, I would like to encourage him and to encourage all of us to be brave enough to take the steps that are needed, not to center the negative responses and the backlash that may occur, but to really put at the center the rights of these women, the respect and dignity of these women, and that we need to be brave enough to actually make progress on the ground, make it concrete, make it happen. And that's really what I'd like to say. And it's what Tracy spoke about before, is like that, and the time for talking is over. The time for delivering is now. Let's stop talking. Let's dream, and let's be brave enough to take actions.
Thank you very much, Aotea. No, totally agree.
Really, it is the whakamana tangata that we just have to restore the dignity of everyone that sits in there. And I do feel that for staff as well. We haven't, because we quite rightly have had to focus on the harm that's done with the women. I agree with the others. I think there's harm that's done with staff. We know that there are staff who want to do good things. We know there's some fantastic ideas coming from the top. Let humanity prevail. Let's do human work. Let's absolutely do human work to create the real conditions of change. The escalation of harm is one of the issues that concerns me. So that must be one of the things that when people come in, and it's in the report, they should go out healthier, better than they come in. And I think we've got to have a hand on heart. Do we actually believe that has occurred? Can we hand on heart say that people who are exiting, and we know that the evidence shows it's not. So it really is around that human work and allowing people to actually express their humanity in ways that can create the change. Be brave, be courageous. Let's be the global leaders in the world in changing this around.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly sounds like from Dr. Shalev, for your response previously to Indigenous models of service, that there isn't one. We can be a first. We can be a first and do it for ourselves, never mind being a first to do it. So, and
it is the expertise of people like Aotearoa, of the women that this country produces so many prisoners and ex-prisoners. Let's draw on that expertise to create change right across the life force. And
some of that is happening at the moment. I understand with the Te Mana Wāhine program that's happening in Christchurch. As I understand that's happening. Is that right?
They are, and they're drawing on the ones. And I think that's the thing. It's just being able to sustain that, to encourage that, to recognize, you know, that there will be challenges, there will be difficulties. You can't create a system, outside system as well, where we have such inequality, such structural violence, such racism, and think we're going to fix that by having a panel of women. But those panel of women will create change. Let's see that. So that's the other element. And so failure works in the system. But at the moment, we have a system that is failing women, that is failing whānau, which is failing communities, which is failing the nation. So we've got to be brave. You can't, the status quo is just not acceptable. And I know that there are so many people working within the system and outside of the system wanting to create those systems of change.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, before we wrap up our session, I'm just wondering, I'll just give you a final opportunity. If there's anything you want, any of the panelists would like to say before we hand over to Jess. Dr. Shalev, please feel free to take the opportunity to provide some final words or some.
Well,
I know you have to sleep.
Do I look half asleep? No, I'm quite awake now. I don't know that I'll be able to sleep tonight, but really is, first of all, to thank the women that spoke to me and the staff members and the Department of Corrections for providing data. And to thank you, the Human Rights Commission, for allowing this kind of follow-up. I think it's really important to just keep on the case and come every so often and say, hey, you know, I'm here to see how things are going. So there is some continuity and you enable that, and thank you for that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shalev. Just for everyone's notice, it must be going on 11 o'clock or after 11 o'clock now back home for Sharon. So we really, really thank you for making the time to be with us. And it's an honor to be in the same space as you. So thank you, Dr. Shalev. Aotearoa, sister, do you have any final, would you like to make some final comments before we finish?
Really, my comments would be aimed at the women in the prisons now and the formerly incarcerated women in our community. Don't lose hope. Keep hanging on. We're all trying to work to improve the conditions inside the prison and outside the prison. I want to encourage them to find their voices, to use their voices, to speak up, to speak out about what's happened to them, because it is changing hearts, it is causing people to think, and their experiences are valid. What happened to you should never have happened to you, and I just want to encourage them to keep going and to stay strong, and we won't stop until we're free. We're pursuing justice. And at the moment it feels like it's just us, but we're enough and we can do it.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, Aotearoa. Your message will be heard, and we'll tweet it out and put it on our social media because it's so important. Thank you very much. Dr. McIntosh.
I guess that, you know, really just drawing on what Aotearoa is saying, that we have this incredible expertise, founded under conditions of inequality, founded under conditions of dispossession. We want greater levels of safety in our communities, and we don't believe that the prison process at the moment actually contributes towards that. I'm going to finish with one line from a poem of one of the women who goes, her name in terms of her poetry is Maya, and it starts, you know, maybe chances were never chanced and life never breathed me. You know, and I think that issue is we can't afford to squander these opportunities. We can't afford that the generations that are yet to become, that this will be their trajectory. So we have a real obligation to draw on that expertise and to create really transformative change. Tihei Mauri ora.
Thank you very much, Dr. McIntosh. I do believe there's a movement. There's a movement going forward. So very, very important that our our wāhine and the affected whānaus know they're not alone. There is a movement going on. I have met with Minister Davis. I do believe his intentions. He really, really wants to do better, and is working really hard behind the scenes. So there's plenty of there are many voices, and we have a lot of hope for better news. But as he's saying, Professor McIntosh, has to happen now, not in the next 5 or 10 years. We need to make the decisions and investments urgently. So thank you very much. Well, that brings our panel discussion to an end. I want to thank everybody who's listening in and who's participated. And I want to, as a Samoan, can I say, familiatu ka whai ua soliele mamalu, e se upu se whaamangalo mai le nei au auna. Ia manuia oto. Yeah. Jess, could I hand it to you, please, to wrap up our panel? But thank you again, Dr. Shalev, Professor McIntosh, and Aotearoa for your time and your wisdom and your humility. Thank you.
Kia ora. E rere kawana ngā mihi naunui ki ngā kai kōrero, mō o whakaro tino whakahirihira. Ngā mihi kia koutou katoa e mahi ana ki enei kaupapa nui. Nō reira, hei whakakapi i tō tātou hui, kia karakia tātou. Kia tau te rangi maari e ki rungi a tātou katoa. Ruia, 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 ruia. Ruia ki runga, ruia ki raro. Ruia ki roto, ruia ki wako. Ruia ki uta, ruia ki tai. Hu ana ki te rangi, turu ana ki nuku. Nā kua tau, kua mau, kua ia, tihei, mauri ora. Kia ora tātou.
Taka taka te ha ki te uru Taka taka te ha ki te tonga Kia makina kina ki uta Kia matara tara ki tai Kia hia ke ana te atakura He tio He huka He hauhu Ti hei